Welcome back, students. Today we're going to talk about historical influences of the United States government. Let's start by discussing some ancient influences on our government, ancient cultures that have, in one way or another, shaped how our government does things today. The two ancient cultures we're going to focus on are Athens and Rome. Athens was a part of Greece, and it's significant to us because it was the birthplace of democracy. People in Athens, citizens in Athens, were able to vote on and decide the rules and policies that their society was going to follow. And this may not seem special to us today when democracy is something that we are very familiar with and kind of take for granted. But if you think back to ancient times, the idea of letting your people make decisions or have any kind of influence on the government was a very unique thing. So Athens was doing stuff well ahead of its time. They were, of course, one of the Greek city-states, and because of the small scale, the small size, and relatively small population, they could practice a form of direct democracy. And direct democracy means citizens are making direct decisions and directly voting on the laws that they're going to follow. The second ancient culture that influenced our government is Rome. Rome borrowed the idea of democracy from Athens, but Rome was a much larger place. It covered a lot more territory and involved a lot more people. So the direct democracy model that Athens had followed in that small city-state is not going to work for a large society like Rome. Rome adjusted the ideas of Athenian democracy and decided that the best way to make democracy happen in a large scale was to elect representatives. This is what is referred to as republican democracy, with the word republic meaning representative democracy. This is something that we're much more familiar with today because we essentially do the same thing. We elect representatives to vote on laws for us rather than directly deciding them ourselves. So how did it come to be that these ancient cultures are influencing our government even today? Well, it all goes back to our founders, the people that created our system of government and wrote our Constitution. They studied ancient history. They studied Athens. They studied Rome. They were very familiar with how those societies operated, how those governments operated. So they knew the pros and the cons, what would work and what wouldn't work, and they borrowed ideas from both of these societies when they designed our government. We still carry with us today these ideas of democracy and republican democracy. Next, let's look at some influences that have come to us by way of England. So you have to remember that America, the United States, started out as an English colony. So there's a lot of connections that we have between us and England. The other thing that you need to remember is that the English, throughout their history, developed a fairly unique attitude or fairly unique approach to government. And, of course, this was something that was shaped over hundreds of years of development in England. And there are a couple of high points that we want to explore that illustrate just how English ideas about government were shaped. And hopefully you can then draw connections to what we have going on in the United States now. The first big shift for England happened with a document called Magna Carta. Magna Carta is a word that means Great Charter, and it was written in England in the year 1215. Why is this significant? Well, it's significant because this is the first time, certainly in English history, that the power of a king, the power of a monarch, was limited. And essentially how it happened was that the king was doing things that displeased the other noble lords, noble families in England. And those noble lords, those barons and knights, decided that they would use the power of numbers, the fact that there was more of them than the king, to essentially gang up on the king and forced the king to promise to accept some limits on his power and stop acting up in a way that they didn't like. So they drafted this document called Magna Carta and essentially made the King of England sign it. It did some important things. It created, as I mentioned earlier, this idea that a government, even a king, should be limited. It also established a few rights that people enjoy today. These rights include trial by jury. So a person could not be convicted of a crime without being tried by a group of their peers. It also created the idea of due process of the law, that in order for a person to be imprisoned, they had to be tried and treated appropriately. And the other thing that it created was the idea of a second branch of government, in this case a legislative branch of government that the English refer to as Parliament. Now, keep in mind that in Magna Carta days, back in 1215, these rights and membership in Parliament only applied to the nobles. In other words, if you were an average person, it wasn't very likely that you'd get to enjoy a trial by jury or a seat on Parliament. But the point is that these ideas are being created at this time. The next big development that we need to discuss is the English Petition of Right. The English Petition of Right is a document from the 1600s. And the context of this document is an event in England called the English Civil War. The English Petition of Right, we're talking like, 400 or so years after Magna Carta, is an expansion of the ideas that Magna Carta created. One of the important concepts or ideas that was established by the English Petition of Right was this idea of rule of law, that the law exists and that everyone, even a king, has to follow and comply to the law. No one is above the law, even a king. Think about how foreign an idea this would be in the 1600s, but this is something that we expect and follow today. There are other specific ideas that you need to remember and associate with the English Petition of Right. The English Petition of Right guaranteed that right to trial by jury. It was created by Magna Carta to all people. It established protections of private property. It protected people from martial law. Martial law is when the military takes control. And it protected people from having to quarter troops. Quartering troops means having to house and feed the government's soldiers in your home. This document, the English Petition of Right, created or enhanced all of these ideas. The third development from England is the English Bill of Rights. This is also from the 1600s, but a couple of decades after the English Civil War. England had a pretty confused stretch of time there in the mid to late 1600s. They had an English Civil War, and then following that, about 30 or 40 years later, they had another event called the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution was sort of what sealed the deal and set the tone for English government from then on out. It did some important developments that not only affected England, but also affect us today. The first thing that comes out of the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights is this idea that Parliament, that legislative branch of government that was created by Magna Carta, needed to be on more equal footing with the king. So here for the first time in England you see not only more than one branch of government, but you see two branches of government that are, in a sense, equal with one another. Particular details from the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights that you need to remember. The English Bill of Rights abolished standing armies. What this meant was that a king could not keep soldiers around if the country was not at war. The English Bill of Rights provided for free elections. It meant that voting would be accessible and easy for people to do. It created a right to petition. And in this case, what petition means is a person's right to essentially complain to the government and demand that the government make changes without fear of being punished. Tying back into that idea that Parliament should be equal with the king, the English Bill of Rights established some checks and balances, the means by which Parliament could control or influence the power and decisions that the king was making. So that's England and the three important English documents. Make sure you can remember Magna Carta, English Petition of Right, and English Bill of Rights, and distinguish one from the other. Next, let's shift gears and talk about influences that arose from America's experience as an English colony. So here's a couple of generalities. Colonies, English-controlled territory in the what would become the United States, had to have some kind of local government. They had to establish some way of setting rules and laws and policies for the people who were living over here to follow. And this is simply because we were across an ocean from England. So as much as England wanted to control and influence our behavior over here, it took a long time to get one of those old ships across the ocean, and therefore communication was not great. We had to rely on local leaders and local government for doing things. So how were these local governments established? They were typically established through charters, colonial charters. The Jamestown Charter is a really good example of this. Now, you need to remember one specific thing about what the Jamestown Charter did for people in Virginia. It guaranteed that English rights would be preserved and protected for colonists living in America. In other words, if you got on a ship from England, sailed across the ocean, landed in Virginia, you were not giving up your English rights just because you were living far away from England. Local governments in the colonies took on different characteristics depending on where you were. In Virginia, the society was based on agriculture. People valued large farms. And since colonists in Virginia tended to have larger tracts of land, they didn't live so close with their neighbors, and you didn't see a lot of towns develop. It's much more a society based on farms and plantations. Therefore, the people were spread out, and it was very hard to collect everyone together to make important decisions. Virginia solved this problem by establishing representative democracy or republican democracy. They established the House of Burgesses. What would happen with the House of Burgesses is that the eligible voters in Virginia would elect one of their own to meet the House of Burgesses and make decisions on Virginia's local laws. New England had happened a little differently. The society in New England was shaped a little differently. People in New England were much more likely to live in a town than on a gigantic farm. And since they lived in towns and were close together, it was easier to get the towns and the villages together to make decisions. Therefore, New England local government had a much more direct democracy feel to it. If you lived in a New England town, it was much more likely that you could vote directly on the rules and the laws and the policies that your town would follow.